Imagine a world where you get home from the pet store or you get your plants in the mail and you can just drop them in your aquarium and walk away. That's it. You're done. You drop them in and you walk away. Well, that's pretty much the style of planted aquarium that I've been pioneering unintentionally now for several years. And we're going to talk about that today. And we're also going to break down tissue culture plants. And I'm going to show you what I do typically with tissue culture plants. And this can help you with your tissue cultures, regardless of what kind of substrate you have. Now, if it hasn't become blaringly obvious yet, the aquarium that I've got in the background of the video here today has no substrate. But that's okay. The methods that I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to go over using those methods with tissue culture plants with no substrate or with various types of substrate like sand, soil, aqua soil, and even gravel. Now, I've been growing plants this way for years, and I've pioneered and am continuing to learn and continuing to be the spear point of growing plants in aquariums where the plants themselves don't rely on substrate in any way. Matter of fact, the closest thing to a substrate in some of my planted aquariums is the aquarium waste. So to get it out of the way, I'll just explain briefly that I am the first hobbyist and first aquarist in the universe to think of the idea of simply testing home aquarium waste to figure out what's actually inside. And I sent off my aquarium waste to a professional soil and wastewater analysis lab. Now you can do that too, and I actually suggest that you do. If you're watching this and you have not yet Googled the professional soil and wastewater analysis labs in your area, I would highly suggest you do. The test is very inexpensive. And once you do it, it's going to change the way that you look at your planted aquariums. So what did I find was in the detritus, the mulm, the gunk, the waste in my aquarium, mostly containing snail poop, shrimp poop, nanofish poop, all the stuff that us regular fish keepers have, all the common livestock, and then of course, some waste from the plants themselves. Well, the lab testing showed that it actually has every single thing from top to bottom that aquarium plants need to thrive. And I think that that's a big reason why so many different substrate types, from no substrate like you see here, completely inert substrate that plants cannot eat from in any way like rocks and gravel or sand, and even aqua soils, garden soil, organic soil. No matter what kind of substrate you have, there's a pretty good chance you have livestock in your aquarium that you're feeding and is creating waste. And that waste is what I had tested. We had nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, sodium, iron, manganese, zinc, copper. That's right. All of it in the aquarium waste. And, you know, in the aquarium hobby, the most common thing that gets said about the waste is it gets called excess nitrates or excess nitrogen. And although it does have nitrogen in it, it's safely stored inside that solid waste. So it's not up in your water column where it can be basically used as a buffet for algae, because your plants, believe it or not, are extremely versatile and very adaptive. And as you can see here, I don't have any signs of deficiencies in my plants. All of these small plants that you see lining the front in front of that Süßwasser tank, all of the small ones started out as tissue culture plants. And I've got a tissue culture plant right here, a top fin, which is the PetSmart house brand, Underwater World's tissue culture, Bacopa. And it's a live aquatic plant. I've taken most of the tissue culture out already and washed off the agar, and I've got it here in just some water so we can use it, look at it, demonstrate it, and I'm actually going to show you the multiple methods that I've used over the years for weighing down plants in an aquarium like this without substrate. And regardless of what kind of substrate you have, it's a big issue for people who get these tissue cultures because they're typically on the small side as far as the root mass goes. So in a lot of different kinds of substrates, you go to plant it, the next day you come home and it's floating at the top. So these methods can help you with that as well. Now let's talk about the actual tissue culture itself. You can get these various ways. This particular one comes in a bag. Like I said, I've already kind of got into it there. I did tape it closed at the top just so that it didn't dry out or anything. But the way that you see these plants in here is pretty much how all of them were. There's, I didn't count them, but there's several, maybe like 1, 2, 3. There was 4 of these bunches of plants here. As you can see, there's multiple stems, but they all originate from a single base down here. And whether you get this in a cup with your tissue culture or you get it in a bag like this, it's going to have that gel inside. And as you can see, some of my gel has kind of liquefied, and that's okay. Now, this gel typically will get to more of a liquid state with heat, but also with age, it has a tendency to break down a little bit. But let's talk about that gel that's inside. What exactly is it, right? So the tissue culture media itself, that gel, contains growth promoting hormones like auxins and cytokinins, right? Now, when they're growing this plant, like at the, you could say laboratory, but basically at the manufacturer, when they're growing these plants, they want them to grow as fast as possible, right? The faster they can grow that plant, the quicker they can sell it. The faster they grow that plant, the more plants they can sell. And so they use like a supercharged gel. And a lot of times what they'll do is when they place it into the cup or into the bag, they know that it's going to be limited on how tall it can grow. As you can see here, all of these were like this, by the way. They've grown all the way to the top of the bag and they're kind of bent over. And you can even see where the plant itself is kind of bunched up there as it reached the top of that bag. So they put a little bit more of like a neutral gel in there because they know that it's going to go through shipping and it's going to sit on the shelf at the store. But it still has a limited amount of sucrose in the gel that the plant can consume. And the physical limit of the cup or the bag, as far as how big it is, pretty much is the biggest restrictor on growth. In the case of this bag, once the plant hits that lid and the humidity and lack of gas exchange kind of naturally trigger a slower metabolic state. But what they don't do, and I've heard this mentioned before elsewhere, is they don't put like a growth inhibitor in here because they want you to have the best chance, at least ethical companies would want you to have the best chance of basically explosive growth. They want you to put that in the tank and for the plant to grow. They're in the business of you being happy and buying more plants, right? So a lot of people have problems with tissue culture plants melting, and sometimes it just simply cannot be avoided. Other times mistakes could be made, and it's very nuanced and there's a million different reasons why things could go wrong. But when you're looking at the different variables that it could be, one thing that you really don't have to worry too much about is it having been something in that gel, you know, that has kind of slowed down the plant, if that makes sense. They do use growth promoting hormones to accelerate cell division in the sterile environment where they're growing these, and they're designed to maximize growth. So once you get ready to plant these in your aquarium, you have to remember that once you wash off this gel, which you're going to want to do, you rinse it off. You can use cool or warm water. You don't want to use hot water by any means. But it's easier to rinse off if the water is a little bit on the warm side, and you want to just be gentle. So that's what I've done here is I've rinsed some off, and we'll take a look at just one of the bunches. Now, if you wanted to, you could separate this plant into several stems by just kind of breaking it apart there at the mass at the bottom. But the way that I'm going to plant these in the aquarium is I'm interested in just weighing this down. So I'm going to weigh it down as a bunch because that's how it was grown. And I'm just going to keep it together as a bunch. And the idea is once these longer pieces get long enough, at that time, I'll cut them and then I'll re-weigh down the taller parts. And that's pretty much how I roll with the faster growing stem plants. Like this octopus plant you see in the back of this aquarium, those are single tops that I've cut off of other plants. And those tops, once they reach the top of the aquarium, which this one is almost there, instead of letting them kind of fold over and grow underneath the surface or even trying to get them to grow up out of the surface, I'll cut this plant about right here. And what happens is at the spot you cut it, most times it's going to grow 2 new stems. So this single stem becomes 2. And then I would take this piece from here up and I would weigh it down over here next to it. And after a month or 2, you actually will have 3 plants instead of 1 plant. And you just do that over and over again. Eventually, you kind of end up with some wacky growth at the bottom as it splits off. But depending on what's in front of it, it may or may not bother you the way it looks. And if it does bother you, you just cut up here. And you could sell, trade, rehome, throw away, dry out, feed to your fish, the bottom part of the plant. It's really up to you. So for today's example, I'm going to leave this as a solid bunch of plants. But what I want to talk about is options that you have when you're going to buy your plants at the store. Maybe you're not even getting a tissue culture. Maybe you're getting a plant from the pet store that has a weight around the bunch at the bottom, kind of like this. A lot of times they're flat. It's a little cheaper sometimes to buy it like this in like a coil. And what I do is I use little strips, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but I'll take pliers and just flatten this coil out. But typically it'll come like this, more of a flat piece here. Let me get the focus in. But so this is more of a flat plant weight. You can use these. And then, of course, you see I've got some biomedia down there. And if you look here in the aquarium, at this taller crypt here towards the back, from this angle, it's kind of hard to tell, but I'll move the camera here before too long, and you'll see that this right here in front of my finger, inside the aquarium, behind that Susswasser tank, it's just one of these pieces of biomedia that I've put a drop of super glue on. And you can see how I've used this one in the past. It's still got a little bit of super glue on the top of it from having something glued to it. But I just put a dollop of super glue on there, and then I'll take the bottom of the plant and set it on here, just like this. And then it holds the plant down in the water. It's pretty straightforward. Depending on the size of the plant and how buoyant it is, you may need a bigger or a smaller weight for that. But for these today, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple methods of how you can use plant weights to hold a plant down in an aquarium like this with no substrate. But even with substrate, you can use this method to keep your tissue culture, or really any plant, from floating up and out of the substrate, especially like aqua soil. Sometimes it can be a little tough to keep your plants actually planted. Now, I've kind of, again, more or less pioneered this method of figuring out different ways to do this, because I couldn't find any examples of anyone else doing this when I first started doing it. And typically from the pet store, you know, whether it's a flat weight or a coil like this, it'll just be loosely wrapped around the base of the plant down here. That's nothing new. But what I tried to do is find out ways to do it that used less plant weight and allowed me to weigh down like individual plants. And you see that here with these crypts and stuff. Again, these were all started as tissue cultures and just dropped in here. But if you look down at the base of this plant, right in the center of the screen, you'll see that's a flat plant weight, and it's just clamped onto a single small root on the plant. If you look at the one next to it, you can see right there above that yellow shrimp, you can see the flat plant weight there. That's on all of these. It looks like that's the crypt flamingo, and it's doing great. There's another one of the plant weights. There's two of them. There's one kind of standing up and there's one laid over. So it's a pretty easy deal. And when you do it, as long as you're gentle with the plant weight and you're not like really clamping down real hard, I haven't had too many problems using this method, but I have found that some plants just don't take well to having a weight clamped around a root or even around the plant itself, which is one of the methods I'm going to use here with this Bacopa. So what could happen is the plant may actually melt where you have it clamped down. Now, my experience doing this, if you're doing any kind of like jungle with it, where you have a bunch of plants like this that are near each other, the Suswassertang in there is a little bit of a wild card because it's a ton of small pieces of plants. But as far as all of these big stem plants, all of their roots are going to kind of intertwine and intertangle with each other. And if one of them melts away from the plant weight that's holding it down, as long as the plants around it are held down, it'll be fine. I found that it kind of creates its own substrate, the roots do. They create like a mat. And you'll find that if you go to take a bunch of plants out of any substrate, you'll find that a lot of times the roots just make a mat that kind of intertangle all the plants together. So with this first one, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the plant and I'm going to make like a loose loop using the plant weight. So I made kind of an example one here to show you, but the one that I'm going to use is a longer piece than that. And I'm just going to literally make kind of a loop here like that. And I'm going to put it around. As you can see, there's a bunch of roots here. They're pretty small because they've been growing in that agar. So I'm going to take this and just clamp it on some of the roots. And then you want to, I like to hold it upside down a little bit like a blizzard from Dairy Queen. If you're from the South, you know what I'm talking about. Although they did stop doing that apparently. But that's it. Now I can take this and gently set it down in the bottom of this aquarium, and that plant weight is going to hold the plant down. Now, if you want to, something you can do is you can float your new plants, whether it's a tissue culture or some plants that you got just like you see this Bacopa, like as a bunch from the pet store or maybe in the mail. If you want, you can just float them, and you don't have to float them forever, but you can float them at the top of the aquarium. But what can happen is as they're floating around at the top, which I actually have an example here, this is another piece from that same tissue culture. When they're floating at the top of your aquarium, first off, if you have too many floating plants, depending on what kind of plant it is, they can kind of shade each other out. They can even make each other melt just from being like too close to each other and pressing against each other and stuff like that if you've just got too much of them together. When it comes to stem plants and plants obviously other than duckweed and plants that are designed to float at the top. But so you can float it like this, but the problem you're going to have is a couple. The first one is typically when plants are laying on their side or floating like this sideways, they're going to grow roots down along the stem. Now that happens sometimes anyways with plants. Sometimes they just want extra support to be held down. But what I've found is that stem plants and other plants that typically secure themselves with their roots in substrate in an aquatic environment, somehow it seems like the plants know when they're just floating around. And in my experience doing this for several years, the floating plants that are stem plants or even swords, it seems like they put more effort and energy into growing longer roots as if they're almost searching for something to anchor down in. And the top half of the plant doesn't grow as fast when it's floating. It'll still grow and it'll most likely grow great. But that's just one thing I've noticed. Another thing I've noticed is that if this plant is in here and it's growing like it is right now, the leaves are going to orientate themselves towards the light. And if I come in here one day and accidentally or just haphazardly turn the plant over, then that bend in the plant is typically going to stay there, and the new growth on the plant, as far as the stem goes, is going to start going another direction. With some plants, it's not too big of a deal, but with crypts, like we see here at the bottom of this tank, it is a big deal. It kind of makes them real gnarled, and they're really hard to plant when you go to actually plant them because they're all bent out of shape. So that was really the reason initially that I got into just weighing plants down. I had some stem plants and some swords and crypts that were extra plants I was going to trade or sell, and I just needed a place to store them. And a bare bottom, no substrate quarantine tank ended up being that place. And a couple days quickly turned into a couple weeks and then a couple months. And I had weighed them down to avoid them looking gnarled, because especially if I'm going to sell them or trade them, I don't want them to look weird, right? And that's when I realized, like, hey, these plants grow really well just weighed down. I wonder how that can be, because the only thing on the bottom of this aquarium is shrimp poop and snail poop. And that's what led me to testing the detritus. And it was kind of an accident. I didn't set out to say, hey, no one's done this, I better do it real quick. It was just kind of a natural progression of my fish keeping experience. So this Bacopa, again, it's from PetSmart, and I have not had many problems with really any brands of aquarium plants as a tissue culture. What I've found is that as long as you're kind of gentle with it, and as long as you don't wait too long to plant them, typically they do okay, but you will see some melting, and some plants just seem to melt more than others. I've had crypts, like out of these ones that are in the front, I had hardly any melt with them, and that's not because of anything I did. I think I just got lucky. Typically crypts melt when you move them. It's just part of it. So what I do expect to see from these stems of Bacopa over time is I do kind of think some of the leaves may melt off, but if you subscribe to the channel or you check back, you'll be able to see the progression of these Bacopa stems, because I've got, I think, 4 or 5 little groups of them here. I'm going to put a couple of them in this aquarium, and I'm going to put a couple of them in the aquarium next door. Now, this plant cage here that you see is another thing that you can use when it comes to weighing down plants in a bare bottom aquarium or no substrate aquarium, or even if you've got any kind of substrate. It's just an option. This comes from Petco, and as far as I know, they're the only ones currently selling this. They call it a plant cage. Most in the hobby would call this a moss dome, but it's got a base here with weights in it, and that just keeps it held down in the aquarium. It's vented on the bottom to allow water inside so it sinks. And then what you do is you would take some cuttings, like I did some trimming of pearlweed recently in one of the aquariums above here. So I would just take some handfuls of that pearlweed and I would stuff it in here, making sure to cover as much of the actual plastic as I want or as I can. And then you simply take it and you screw it onto the base. It's pretty easy to do. And then this sits at the bottom of the aquarium. And what you end up with is more or less like a chia pet of moss, or like I said, I love to use Pearlweed to do this with. I'll show you here. I've got one and it's just starting to grow in. If you trim this, you don't have to trim it very short, but every time you trim the pieces as they get long and they're trying to grow up towards the light, they sprout off to the side, and those side sprouts will root down to the cage. And so those empty parts of the cage you see here that don't have plants growing out of it yet, eventually that'll all kind of get overtaken by the pearlweed, and it ends up like a really cool bush. And it's just something that, regardless of what kind of substrate you have, is kind of fun to do, and it gives a really unique look. So that's one of the things I like as well about growing any kind of aquarium plant in a no substrate aquarium like this. It just really has a different look to it. So this particular plant, like I said, I just kind of loosely made a loop, and then I kind of clamped down that loop onto a bunch of the roots, or a portion of the roots. I don't want to say a bunch. So this next one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an even larger loop like this. And as you can see, it's got a lot of space in there. It's very circular, right? And so what you can also do is you can take that and you can either go around one stem, which in my experience has a tendency to make the plant lay on its side at the base. Or you can take this loop and put it around the very base of the plant where all the stems are growing out, and you just want to tighten it just enough where it's not clamped on the plant at all, but the mass at the bottom is keeping it in that loop, if that makes sense. And you would take this, and just like we did with the first one, you're just going to carefully set it down. I put some food in here for these shrimp as we started the video, so I don't want to kamikaze drop a plant right on their head. But as you can see, this one, when I look at the base, it's in there straight, but those stems in the bag were growing off to the side like that. So I'm going to let it stay like that, and I'm going to hope that those stems straighten out as the plant searches for light over the next few days while the light's on. Who knows if they're going to straighten out or not. Again, if you want to check in on this little project, make sure you subscribe to the channel and check back. These two plants, what I'll do for the next several weeks is I'll have them in this aquarium probably for the next several months, and we'll be able to track their progress. So if you look for my videos in the future, you just look for these plants in there, and you'll know that they did start out in this bag as a tissue culture, and they just got weighed down from the bag. So straight from the lab environment to a bare bottom aquarium. So these are two ways to use those plant weights. As you can see, this one on the left, we made that loose, very large circular loop with it and just kind of cuffed it over the base of the plant. And then on this second one, I made more of a pincher shape to it, and I actually physically pinched the root where the weight kind of made a clamp. And so that's being held by the weight that way. Both of those ways can work, but in my journey weighing down these plants, another option that I started to try that seems to also work very well is, like I mentioned before, just simply glue the plant using like a drop of super glue to a piece of biomedia. So if we see here that white there underneath the base of that crypt is just a single piece of biomedia that I put a drop of super glue on and press some of the roots from that crypt there onto the top of the biomedia. And that one piece of biomedia, luckily, is enough to hold down that crypt. As it grows, it may start to float up, and that'll be our sign to just either switch out that piece, or you could actually take a second piece of biomedia and glue it to that first piece. But this is the biomedia that I used. It's just, you know, the stuff that would go in your filter. And the reason I used it was twofold. I used it because I had it, so I didn't have to order something on the internet. And then the other reason why I used it is I was interested in different methods other than rocks. Obviously, you can use a rock, a pebble, a stone, But I was interested in trying some methods outside of these plant weights, because the thing with the plant weights is typically they're supposed to be made out of a pot metal, like a malleable metal that's very soft, and they're not supposed to have large amounts of lead in them. But you know, the plant weight industry is not regulated, so who knows if there's lead in them and how much lead is in them. So I just think it's kind of a safer bet to use the biomedia. So those are two ways you can hold your plants down with tissue cultures. And if you're planting it in aqua soil, they can really help to keep that plant anchored long enough for it to develop some roots that are going to keep it from floating away. That's kind of a big part of the average complaint of, I think, people that use these tissue cultures, is that they can't figure out how to keep the dang plants planted. So back to the melt thing. If you notice leaves that are falling off, maybe the next day or over the next several days, you notice leaves that are floating at the top of the aquarium, it's not a big deal. My suggestion is, if you can, to just avoid messing with the plant. Just let it sit there. If there is detritus or aquarium waste, gunk, malm, whatever you like to call it, in your aquarium from your fish or your shrimp or your snails, it's going to have nutrients that are getting broken down by bacteria in your water column. Those nutrients kind of get dissolved into the water. So your plant will be more than fine. It'll have stuff to eat, and it just needs some time. It's not that complicated. Your best bet is just to monitor the new growth on your plants. That's what I've done for years, and it's worked really well for me. As these plants grow, the older leaves eventually, unfortunately, don't last forever. And a lot of times they'll start melting away. At some point, in some way, the plant slowly starts to kind of shed off those old leaves as it puts more and more energy into growing the top of the plant. So I go off the new growth of my plants, and if I feel like the plants are suffering, which has not honestly happened to me other than in situations with, for instance, this many plants, if all I had in this aquarium was a single betta fish and I was feeding the betta fish every other day, well, that's not a whole lot of aquarium waste getting created. So obviously there are situations where you may need to look into, depending on your type of substrate, some root tabs, or maybe even some liquid fertilizers. But for the most part, I haven't had any issues at all, even with no substrate. And it's because these plants are able to really find a way to make it happen. Aquarium plants are, for lack of a better term, fancy ditch plants, and they grow in the first few feet of water in ponds and lakes and streams where there's light penetration. And these bad boys are adapted to some very harsh conditions. So to be in an aquarium like this, it's really kind of a vacation for them in a lot of instances. As long as you've got a good quality LED light and you've got some nutrients in the water column, it's a pretty easy deal. So the whole plant is a root. It can use what's called passive transport to just take in nutrients straight from water. And with aquarium plants, that's how they prefer to roll. Why is that? Because if it had to use active transport, which is the way that plants on dry land eat, is active transport, that takes a lot of the plant's energy. And so it doesn't grow as good, because just as simple math, it doesn't have as much energy to grow because it had to use that energy to get the nutrients directly from some kind of substrate. So whether it's feeding at the roots or the stem or the leaves, it's getting it from the water in most cases. So regardless of what kind of substrate you use, it's soaking in water, and your plants prefer that those nutrients dissolve into the water first, because that's the way you can feed these aquarium plants, where they can then put 100% of their energy into growth. Now it gets a step more simple. If this plant wants to grow at the very tip of this stem, it's not going to take in the nutrients from the tip of the root down here and use energy to transport those nutrients all the way up to the tip of the stem. We're not talking about a tree. A tree can't get nutrients from the air, so it has to transport nutrients from way down there. But these aquarium plants, they can take in nutrients directly from the tip of that stem to grow the stem longer. They can take in nutrients from this leaf to make the leaf bigger. They don't need to use energy, and they prefer to not use energy to move those nutrients to where they need them if they can. Now let's talk about if these plants need anything special to go from a tissue culture to transition to being submerged in water. Now, transitioning from immersed, which means growing in a bag with air in it, to submerged, which means down in the bottom of the water of our aquarium. It's a physiological response for these plants to make this transition. Once they realize that the CO2 levels are way different, and there's now nutrients in the air because the air is water that's full of nutrients, well, this usually occurs within just a few days. Now, it's not a sleep cycle. It's not like a hormonal experience like puberty. It's just simple phenotypic plasticity. So these plants, once you submerge them in the water, some plants will melt. Some plants may not melt. If they melt, don't worry. Just leave it. It'll be great. The more you mess with it, the more you move it around while it's in that transition, it can just stress the plant out. So let's talk about organic debris like that detritus and waste that I talked about, testing for its nutrient value. Now, organic breakdown of that waste is how nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus become available to the plants. Nature is not clean. Plants evolved specifically to thrive in nutrient-rich organic environments where the water column itself has the nutrients that the plants need to grow. So don't worry if you've got a little bit of aquarium waste in there, or maybe you've got a lot of aquarium waste in there. Your plant doesn't care. It's going to use what it can use when it can use it. And if there's too much that there's some left, something else will use it. Trust me, whether it's algae or some of your other plants. Now, one and the most common way that aquarists would test to make sure they don't have too many nutrients, obviously the notorious nitrate test. But to be honest, there's so many other things that are also in your aquarium water that it's really impossible to know that your plants fully have everything they need. And knowing that aquarium waste has all those nutrients is just kind of a ease of the mind to know that as long as your fish and your snails are pooping, you're probably good to go. So if you, again, want to check in on the growth of these plants over time, make sure you come back to the channel, check out the live streams or the long form videos in the future, hit that subscribe button, and you can kind of see the journey. Now, these tiny little shrimp that have been swimming around throughout this video, you've probably noticed there's some blue and some yellow, and the yellow ones are really small. Those yellow ones are baby yellow Amano shrimp that were born in my aquariums. And I raised the baby Amano shrimp through their larval stage in saltwater. And I use some really easy methods that anyone can do at home. So if you're interested in breeding Amano shrimp, there's a playlist for that on my channel. The other shrimp that are in here are Neocaridina shrimp. You'll see some of them are orange eye Neocaridina. And shrimp and snails are a great way to get that aquarium waste at the bottom so that your plants can thrive. And just a really easy and low effort way to grow up aquarium plants the way they were designed to grow with that passive substrate or passive uptake of nutrients. So if you want to see more, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I appreciate you checking it out today, and we'll see you in the next one.